The rain hammered down on Millbrook's muddy streets like bullets from heaven, each drop a reminder of the violence that had shattered Eliza Matthews's world. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall of Morrison's general store, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew closer. The memory of Roland's voice echoed in her mind, as fresh and brutal as the day he'd first spoken those words 6 months ago. "If you ever try to leave me, Eliza, I'll hunt you down like the worthless animal you are. And when I catch you, I'll make sure you wish you'd never been born." Her fingers trembled as she clutched the medical bag containing the documents that could destroy him. Evidence of embezzlement fraud and worse. The bruises on her ribs, barely healed from his last beating, throbbed with each labored breath. She could still feel his hands around her throat, could still hear his whispered threats about what he would do to her if she ever dared to defy him again. There she is. The shout cut through the storm like a blade. Morrison's men had found her. Eliza ran. The gunshot cracked behind her, and wood splintered from the hitching post beside her head. Another shot closer this time sent mud spraying across her torn dress. Her boots slipped in the mire, sending her sprawling behind a water trough, just as a third bullet whined overhead. "Bring her back alive," came Morrison's sardonic drawl from somewhere in the rain. "Mr. Matthews wants to have a little chat with his runaway wife. Can't imagine why she'd want to leave such a loving husband." His laughter was like broken glass scraping against stone. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched behind the trough, rain streaming down her face. The memory of Roland's last conversation with her flashed through her mind, his fist connecting with her stomach, doubling her over as he hissed about her ungrateful nature and her failure as a woman. She touched the fading bruise on her cheek, hidden beneath careful powder that had long since washed away in the storm. The sound of a horse approaching made her freeze. Through the rain, she could see a lone rider coming down the main street, a Native American man on a painted horse, his long black hair braided with leather and silver ornaments. Even in the storm, he sat his mount with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. "You there, Indian?" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "You seen a white woman running through here, tall brown hair, probably looking like a drowned rat about now." The rider pulled up water streaming from the brim of his hat. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured with only the faintest trace of an accent. "I have seen no one. The storm drives all sensible people indoors." "Don't lie to me, savage," Morrison snarled. "We know she came this way." There was a pause, and Eliza could almost feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning. When the rider spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "I am Chayton of the northern Comanche. I do not lie to white men, nor do I assist them in hunting women through the rain like animals." Morrison's horse pranced nervously as its rider shifted in the saddle. Even a man like Morrison, brutal as he was, had enough sense to recognize danger when he heard it. "Well, if you do see her, there's a reward. Good money for information." "I will remember that." Chayton replied, his tone suggesting he would do nothing of the sort. The sound of hoofbeats gradually faded as Morrison and his men continued their search elsewhere. Eliza remained crouched behind the trough, shivering in the cold rain, afraid to move. Then she heard the soft whinny of a horse very close by. "You can come out now," came Chayton's quiet voice. "They have gone to search the saloons, where they will likely remain until the storm passes." Slowly, Eliza emerged from her hiding place. The Comanche warrior had dismounted and was standing beside his horse, studying her with keen, hazel eyes that missed nothing. Not her torn dress, not the fear in her face, not the way she clutched her medical bag like a lifeline. "You are injured," he observed, noting the slight limp in her step. "It's nothing," Eliza said quickly, then caught herself. There was something in this man's presence that demanded honesty. "An old wound. It troubles me when the weather turns." Chayton nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. "The man who seeks you He is your husband. The word stuck in her throat like a bone. Was. The divorce papers came through yesterday. She touched the documents in her bag unconsciously. He doesn't accept that our marriage is over. Men who hunt women through storms rarely accept anything that diminishes their power. Chayton said simply, "You have nowhere safe to go." It wasn't a question. Eliza felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. No. No family, no friends who would dare stand against Roland Matthews. He's too powerful, too connected. What is your profession? Chayton asked, studying the medical bag she carried. I'm a nurse, trained at Mercy General Hospital in Boston. The words came out steady despite her fear. Her medical training was the one thing Roland had never been able to take from her, though he had tried hard enough. Something shifted in Chayton's expression. My people make their winter camp in the valley beyond the hills. We have great need of someone with healing skills. You would be safe there, honored for your knowledge. The offer was impossible, scandalous. Everything her Boston upbringing had taught her screamed against it. But then she remembered Roland's hands around her throat, his promise to hunt her down, and the look in Morrison's eyes when he spoke of bringing her back. Safety trumped scandal. I would be grateful for sanctuary, she said quietly. Chayton helped her mount behind him on his horse, and they rode out of Millbrook through the storm. As the town disappeared behind them, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the first stirring of hope. The Comanche camp appeared as they crested a ridge, a collection of teepees arranged in a protective circle beside a clear stream. Smoke rose from central fires despite the rain, and Eliza could see people moving about their daily tasks with the easy efficiency of a community that had learned to thrive in harsh conditions. An older woman emerged from one of the larger teepees as they approached. Her weathered face bore intricate tattoos, and her dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving many winters and losses. She spoke rapidly to Chayton in their native language, her tone questioning but not hostile. Like Nady wants to know if you're running from the law or from a man. Chayton translated. I told her it was a man, which she says is often worse. Nady stepped forward and took Eliza's hands in her own, studying her face, with the penetrating gaze of someone who had seen too much suffering to be fooled by surface appearances. When she spoke, her English was accented, but clear. You got the look of a beaten dog, she said bluntly. All flinch and fear. But there's steel in you too, or you wouldn't have run. Come, we'll get you dry and fed, and then you can tell us what kind of trouble's following you. The teepee Nady led her to was warm and surprisingly spacious, with buffalo robes covering the floor, and a small fire burning in the center. As Eliza changed into dry clothes, practical buckskin garments that Nady provided, she tried to process the enormous change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been the wife of one of Boston's most prominent businessmen. Now she was seeking refuge among the Comanche people her society considered savage enemies. But there was nothing savage about the gentle way Nady tended to her injuries or the respectful manner in which the other women of the tribe greeted her. If anything, she felt more human dignity here than she had in years of marriage to Roland. Tell me about this man who hunts you, Nady said as she applied a healing salve to the bruises on Eliza's ribs. What makes him so dangerous? Eliza found herself speaking of things she had never told another soul, Roland's systematic campaign to break her spirit, his threats and violence, his absolute conviction that she was his property to do with as he pleased. But more than that, she told them about the documents she carried, the evidence of his crimes that could bring down not just Roland, but a network of corrupt officials and businessmen throughout the territory. He's not just stealing money, she explained. He's working with someone in the federal government to force tribes off their land using poisoned water supplies and fabricated attacks to justify military action. The silver deposits in these mountains. There's something special about them, something the government wants to control. Nadi and Chayton exchanged a meaningful look that Eliza didn't understand until Chayton spoke. The silver in these mountains is sacred to our people. It has been mined here for generations using methods passed down from our ancestors. Your husband's people believe they can extract it faster, more efficiently, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. What do you mean? Eliza asked. The silver here isn't just precious metal, Nadi explained. It's woven through with other elements that make it incredibly pure, incredibly valuable. Our people learned long ago how to extract it without destroying the land or poisoning the water. The white man's methods. They'll turn this whole valley into a wasteland. Over the next several weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, Eliza found herself settling into the rhythm of camp life. Her medical skills were desperately needed, not just for treating injuries and illnesses, but for combating the effects of the water poisoning that Roland's people had already begun in earnest. She worked closely with Nadi, learning traditional healing methods that complemented her Western medical training. The old woman taught her which plants could neutralize poisons, how to prepare tonics that strengthened the body against contamination, and most importantly, how to see beyond the symptoms to understand the whole person who needed healing. But it was her growing relationship with Chayton that surprised her most. He was nothing like the savage warrior she had been taught to expect. Educated by missionaries in his youth, he spoke several languages fluently and had traveled extensively throughout the West. More than that, he treated her with a respect and gentleness that made her heart ache with its unfamiliarity. "You're afraid," he observed one evening as they sat by the fire watching Eliza tend to a child with fever. "Of course I'm afraid," she replied. "Roland will come eventually. He always does." "Not of him," Chayton said quietly. "Of this, of feeling safe, of being valued for who you are rather than what you can provide." His words hit too close to home. Eliza felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized he was right. The peace she had found here, the sense of belonging and purpose, it terrified her because she knew it couldn't last. Nothing good ever lasted in her experience. "He beat me." She whispered the words coming out in a rush. Not just once or twice, but regularly, systematically. "He said it was to teach me my place, to remind me that I belonged to him. And the worst part is, I started to believe him. I started to think I deserved it." Chayton was quiet for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of understanding that told her he too had known violence and loss. "My first wife was killed in a cavalry attack 3 years ago. For a long time, I blamed myself. If I had been faster, stronger, smarter. But eventually I realized that the fault lay with those who chose violence, not with those who suffered from it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at full gallop. Thomas Running Bear, one of the camp's scouts, pulled up beside the fire with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Soldiers coming," he gasped. 2 days' ride, maybe less. 50 men well armed, led by a white man in expensive clothes. Eliza's heart sank. Roland had found her. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. The tribe's warriors checked their weapons and planned defensive positions, while the women and children prepared to evacuate to hidden caves deeper in the mountains if necessary. Eliza found herself at the center of heated discussions about strategy and tactics. "We could run," suggested one of the younger warriors. "Take what we can carry and disappear into the high country until they give up the search. And abandon our winter stores. Our sick and elderly." Nadi shook her head. "Some of us wouldn't survive a week in the mountains without proper shelter and supplies." "Then we fight," said another. "Make them pay for every step they take into our territory." 50 trained soldiers against 20 warriors. Chayton's voice was grim. "That's not a battle, it's suicide." Eliza listened to the debate with growing desperation. These people had risked everything to give her sanctuary, and now they were going to die because of her. Unless, what if I surrender myself to them? She said quietly. Roland doesn't want to fight you. He just wants me and the documents I carry. If I give myself up, he'll kill you, Chayton said flatly. And then he'll kill us anyway to eliminate witnesses. Not if there are other witnesses, Eliza replied, her mind racing. Federal witnesses. What if we could get word to the territorial marshal if he arrived while Roland was here? The nearest federal marshal is in Helena, 4 days' ride, Thomas Running Bear pointed out. They'll be here tomorrow. It was then that Nadi spoke up with an idea that changed everything. There's another way. A harder way, but possible. We let them come. We let them find what they're looking for. And then we turn their own methods against them. She went on to explain her plan. And as the details emerged, Eliza felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. It was brilliant, audacious, and almost certainly suicidal. It was also their only hope. The soldiers arrived just before noon the next day, riding into the valley in perfect formation. Roland rode at their head, magnificent in his tailored uniform and polished boots every inch, the conquering hero come to reclaim his wayward property. Behind him rode Captain Carson, a career soldier whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and Dr. Hayes, the tribal physician who had been treating the poisoning victims in the nearby white settlements. But it was the fourth rider who made Eliza's blood run cold. Morrison, Roland's enforcer, whose cruel smile promised that whatever happened next would involve considerable pain for those who had defied his master. Well, well, Roland called out as the troops formed a semicircle around the camp. What a touching scene. My dear wife playing house with her savage friends. Eliza stepped forward, her spine straight, and her chin lifted defiantly. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, but facing Roland again still made her stomach clench with remembered fear. I'm not your wife anymore, Roland, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the camp. The divorce papers made that quite clear. Roland's laugh was like breaking ice. Oh, my dear Eliza, did you really think a piece of paper could free you from me? You belong to me, body and soul. You always have, and you always will. Captain Carson urged his horse forward, his expression professionally neutral. Mrs. Matthews, I'm here under orders to escort you back to federal custody. You're wanted for questioning regarding certain financial irregularities involving the Ironwood Railroad Syndicate. The irony was perfect. Roland was using his own crimes as justification for her arrest. But Eliza was ready for this gambit. Financial irregularities, she repeated loudly. You mean the $2 million that Roland embezzled from investor accounts to fund his private ventures? Or perhaps you're referring to his systematic poisoning of water supplies to force native tribes off their land. She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a thick folder of documents. I have evidence of all of it, Captain. Bank records, correspondence with government officials, detailed plans for the silver mining operation that requires the elimination of the Comanche presence in this valley. Roland's face darkened with rage. She's lying, Carson. The woman is clearly deranged. Look at her living like an animal with these savages making wild accusations against her betters. Then you won't mind if we examine the evidence, Chayton said quietly, stepping up beside Eliza. If they're forgeries created by a madwoman, it should be easy enough to prove. Dr. Hayes dismounted and approached the group, his medical bag in hand. Perhaps I should examine Mrs. Matthews first to determine her mental state. The trauma of living among Indians for weeks could certainly have affected her judgment. There was something in Hayes's tone that made Eliza's professional instincts prickle. She had worked with enough doctors to recognize when one was being evasive and Hayes was definitely hiding something. "That won't be necessary, Doctor," she said carefully. "I'm quite capable of determining my own mental state." "I'm afraid I must insist," Hayes replied, moving closer. "As a medical professional, I have a duty to ensure your well-being." It was Morrison who gave the game away. His sardonic grin had vanished, replaced by a look of predatory anticipation that Eliza recognized all too well. Whatever Hayes was planning, Morrison was looking forward to it. "What's in the bag, Doctor?" she asked sharply. Hayes paused, his hand on the clasp of his medical bag. For a moment, his mask of professional concern slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Just some medication to help with your condition." "What condition?" Chayton demanded, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "Hysteria, of course," Hayes replied smoothly. "A common affliction among women who have experienced severe trauma. The medication will help calm her nerves and restore her to a more manageable state." Eliza felt ice in her veins. She had seen what passed for hysteria medication in some of the less reputable institutions she had worked in. Laudanum and worse, designed not to heal, but to render the patient docile and compliant. "I refuse any medication," she said firmly. "And as a trained nurse, I have the right to make my own medical decisions." "You lost that right when you fled your lawful husband and took up with enemies of the United States," Captain Carson said sharply. "Dr. Hayes is acting under federal authority." The trap was closing around them. Eliza could see it in Roland's triumphant smile, in Morrison's eager anticipation, in the way the soldiers had quietly shifted to surround the camp more completely. Whatever Hayes intended to do to her, it would leave her unable to testify against Roland or authenticate the documents she carried. It was then that Nadi's plan went into motion. The old woman had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, apparently just another curious tribeswoman watching the confrontation. Now she stepped forward, her weathered face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "What a white doctor," she said in broken English. "My grandson very sick. Water bad make him weak. You have medicine?" Hayes glanced at her dismissively. "I'm sorry, but I'm here on official business. Perhaps later." "Please," Nadi continued, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "He dying. Need help now." She led Hayes toward one of the teepees, where a young boy lay on a bed of furs, his face flushed with fever, and his breathing labored. The doctor knelt beside him, his professional instincts overriding his other priorities for the moment. "Classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning," he muttered, examining the child's symptoms. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days, Nadi replied. "Since he drank from creek." Hayes nodded grimly. "The water supply contamination is worse than we thought. We'll need to increase the dosage in the upstream injection points." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Hayes realized his mistake a split second too late, his hand going to his gun, just as Chayton's knife found his throat. "So you admit it," Chayton said quietly. "You've been helping them poison the water." Hayes's face had gone white. "You don't understand. The mineral extraction process requires certain environmental modifications. It's all perfectly legal, authorized at the highest levels. And the legal doesn't make it right," Eliza said, stepping closer. "How many children have you helped them kill, Doctor?" "Now, see here." Captain Carson blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. The conversation had taken a turn he clearly hadn't expected. Roland, however, was not a man to be deterred by inconvenient revelations. "Enough of this charade," he snarled. "Morrison, take the woman. Carson, have your men secure the camp. Dr. Hayes can continue his work once we've eliminated these witnesses." Morrison spurred his horse forward, his gun drawn. But he had underestimated the speed of a Comanche warrior. Chayton's throwing knife took him in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle just as the hidden warriors of the tribe opened fire from concealed positions around the camp. The battle that followed was unlike anything Eliza had ever experienced. The valley erupted in gunfire and war cries as the disciplined ranks of federal soldiers found themselves facing an enemy that refused to stand still and fight fair. The Comanche warriors seemed to materialize from nowhere, striking hard and fast before melting back into cover. But they were still outnumbered more than 2-1, and Roland had come prepared for a fight. As the initial confusion died down, the soldiers began to organize a more systematic response, using their superior firepower to pin down the defenders, while other units moved to flank them. Eliza found herself crouched behind an overturned wagon with Chayton reloading his rifle while bullets whistled overhead. The acrid smoke of gunpowder mixed with the smell of burning canvas as several teepees caught fire from the muzzle flashes. "And this isn't working," Chayton said grimly, pausing to take careful aim at a soldier who was advancing on their position. "They're too well trained, too well equipped." "Where's Thomas?" Eliza asked, suddenly realizing she hadn't seen Running Bear since the fighting started. Chayton's expression darkened. "I don't know. He was supposed to be with the flanking party, but..." His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the smoke and chaos, they could see a group of soldiers riding hard toward the center of the camp, led by a figure that made Eliza's heart sink. Thomas Running Bear rode at the head of the charge, his face grim but determined. Behind him came Captain Carson and a squad of his best men, their rifles trained on the teepee, where they knew the tribal elders were sheltering. "Thomas," Chayton called out in anguish. "What are you doing?" Running Bear pulled up just outside of rifle range, his face a mask of pain and conflicted loyalty. When he spoke, his voice carried across the battlefield with terrible clarity. "I'm sorry, my friend. They have my daughter. She's being held in the federal prison in Helena. If I don't cooperate, they'll see that she hangs for the murder of a white settler." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Eliza felt Chayton sag beside her, the fight going out of him, as he realized the impossible position his friend had been put in. "Did she do it?" Chayton asked quietly. "Did Swifthawk kill the settler?" "No," Thomas replied, his voice breaking. "But they have witnesses who will swear she did. White witnesses whose testimony will be believed over any defense we could mount." Roland chose that moment to make his grand entrance, riding into the camp with a triumphant smile on his face. He had shed his uniform jacket, revealing the expensive shirt and vest beneath, and his hair was perfectly styled despite the chaos around him. "A touching family reunion," he called out sarcastically. "But I'm afraid we don't have time for lengthy farewells. My dear wife and I have business to discuss." He dismounted with theatrical flair, adjusting his cuffs as if he were attending a social gathering rather than a battlefield. Behind him, Morrison struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging useless, but his right hand still gripping his pistol with murderous intent. "You should have stayed in Boston, Eliza." Roland continued walking toward her hiding place with casual confidence. "You should have accepted your place and lived quietly with your shame. Instead, you forced me to take drastic measures." "What do you want, Roland?" Eliza called out, not bothering to hide anymore. The game was up, and they both knew it. "What I've always wanted," he replied. "Complete control. You're going to come with me quietly and without resistance. You're going to publicly recant these ridiculous accusations about embezzlement and poisoning. And then you're going to disappear permanently, having tragically succumbed to the mental strain of your experiences among the savages. And if I refuse," Roland's smile grew wider and more predatory, "then I'll have Captain Carson's men execute every person in this camp, starting with the children and working their way up to the adults. I'll claim they resisted arrest and fired on federal troops. Who's going to dispute the word of a decorated army officer?" The ultimatum hung in the air like a curse. Around the camp, the fighting had died down to sporadic gunfire, as both sides waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. Eliza could see the faces of the Comanche families peering out from behind, cover their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of hope and resignation. These people had given her sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn. They had treated her with kindness and respect, had taught her that there was more to strength than the ability to endure suffering. Now they were going to die because of her troubles, unless she found a way to save them. But as she looked into Roland's cold eyes, she realized that surrender wouldn't save anyone. He would kill them all anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. The only difference would be whether she died fighting or died as his victim one last time. The choice when it came to her was surprisingly easy. "Go to hell, Roland," she said clearly. For a moment, Roland's mask of civilized control slipped, revealing the savage fury beneath. "You stupid, ungrateful bitch," he snarled. "I've given you everything: money, position, respectability, and this is how you repay me. You gave me nothing but pain and humiliation." Eliza shot back, standing up from behind her cover with her rifle in her hands. "You turned me into a shadow of myself and called it love. Well, I'm done being your victim." The rifle felt solid and real in her hands, its weight grounding her in the moment. Chayton had taught her to shoot during the quiet evenings in camp, and while she was no expert marksman, she was competent enough to hit what she aimed at. Roland saw the weapon and laughed a sound like breaking ice. "You're going to shoot me, Eliza, you who wouldn't hurt a fly, who spent your whole marriage apologizing for existing. I'm not that woman anymore." Eliza replied steadily. "That woman died the day I decided to run instead of endure. The woman I am now fights back." It was Morrison who moved first, his wounded arm forgotten, as he brought his pistol up in a lightning-fast draw. The gunshot cracked across the camp like thunder, and Eliza felt the bullet tug at her sleeve as she dove sideways. She hit the ground hard, rolling behind a pile of firewood as Morrison's second shot splintered bark inches from her head. Around her, the battle erupted anew as the Comanche warriors opened fire on the exposed soldiers. But this time, the fight was different. Thomas Running Bear, torn between loyalty and conscience, suddenly turned his rifle on Captain Carson instead of the tribal defenders. His shot took the cavalry officer in the chest, spinning him from his saddle with a cry of shocked pain. "Swift Hawk is innocent," Thomas shouted over the gunfire. "I won't be party to genocide for the sake of a lie." The tide of battle began to turn as the soldiers found themselves caught between two fires. Several of them threw down their weapons and fled, unwilling to die for a cause they barely understood. Others, more disciplined or more desperate, continued to fight with the ferocity of cornered animals. Through the chaos, Eliza could see Roland directing his remaining men with cold efficiency. He had drawn his own pistol, now a beautifully engraved weapon that looked more like a work of art than an instrument of death. But there was nothing artistic about the way he used it, dropping one of the fleeing soldiers with a bullet in the back when the man tried to retreat without permission. "Cowards!" Roland screamed at his remaining troops. "Stand and fight. Remember what you're fighting for." "What are we fighting for?" One of the soldiers called back, his voice cracking with stress and exhaustion. "To help you murder a bunch of families for silver rights." Roland's answer was a bullet that took the questioner in the head. "You're fighting because I pay you to fight," he snarled at the others. "And because the alternative is a court-martial for desertion." It was then that the real horror of the situation became clear. These weren't federal troops at all. They were mercenaries, hired killers dressed in military uniforms to give Roland's private war a veneer of official authority. The few real soldiers in the group, like Captain Carson, had been fed lies about the nature of their mission. But mercenaries were a different breed than regular soldiers. They fought for money, not patriotism, and they were perfectly willing to commit atrocities if the pay was good enough. As the battle raged on, it became clear that they had come prepared for wholesale slaughter. One group of gunmen had circled around to the camp's eastern edge, where the women and children were sheltering in a large tepee. Eliza could see them approaching through the smoke, their intentions written clearly on their faces. Without thinking, she broke from cover and ran toward the threatened families, her rifle clutched in her hands. Behind her, she could hear Chayton shouting her name, but she couldn't stop. Those were her people now, her adopted family, and she would not let them die while she cowered behind firewood. The first mercenary saw her coming and turned his rifle in her direction. But Eliza was faster. Her shot took him center mass, dropping him to the muddy ground with a wet thud. The second man got off a wild shot that went high before a native emerged from the teepee, with an old cavalry saber taking him across the back of the neck with a stroke that would have made her warrior ancestors proud. "Told you there was steel in you," the old woman said grimly, wiping the blade clean on the dead man's shirt. But the respite was brief. More gunmen were converging on their position, and ammunition was running low. Worse flames from the burning teepees were beginning to spread, threatening to engulf the entire camp in an inferno. "We have to fall back," Chayton said, appearing at Eliza's elbow with his rifle smoking. "The cave's in the high country, we can make a stand there." "What about the wounded?" Eliza asked, looking at the growing number of injured on both sides. "I can't just abandon them." "You can't help them if you're dead," Chayton pointed out pragmatically. Before Eliza could respond, a new sound cut through the chaos, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of them coming from the direction of the main trail. For a moment, everyone froze, friend and foe alike, wondering if this was reinforcements for Roland or some new player in the deadly game. The answer came in the form of a cavalry bugle, sounding the charge, followed by the appearance of real federal troops cresting the ridge at full gallop. At their head rode a man in a marshal's uniform, his badge gleaming in the smoky sunlight. "United States Marshal Service." The lead rider shouted as his men swept into the valley, "Cease fire immediately." Roland's face went white as he recognized the newcomers. These were legitimate federal authorities, not the bought and paid-for officials he usually dealt with. Their presence meant that someone with real power had taken an interest in his activities. The Marshal Williams. He called out, trying to regain his composure. "Thank God you're here. These savages have been holding my wife hostage, and they've killed several of my men." Marshal Williams was a tall, weathered man, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much corruption to be easily fooled. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking in the burning teepees, the scattered bodies, and the obvious signs of a one-sided battle. "Is that so, Mr. Matthews?" he said mildly. "Then perhaps you can explain why your men are wearing federal uniforms without federal authorization, and why they're carrying weapons that were reported stolen from the Army depot in Fort Collins last month." Roland's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, as he struggled to find an explanation that wouldn't incriminate him further. Meanwhile, Eliza stepped forward with the folder of documents still clutched in her hands. "Marshal Williams," she said clearly. "I'm Eliza Matthews, and I have evidence of federal crimes committed by my former husband and his associates. Embezzlement conspiracy and the systematic poisoning of water supplies to force Native Americans off their land." Williams dismounted and approached her, his expression grave. "Ma'am, I've been tracking Mr. Matthews' activities for the better part of 6 months. If you have documentation to support your claims, I'd be very interested in seeing it." As Eliza handed over the folder, Roland made one last desperate gambit. "She's lying," he screamed. "She's been living with these savages turned against her own kind. Those documents are forgeries fabricated to frame me. Farnanhum. Then you won't mind submitting to a federal investigation." Williams replied calmly, already flipping through the papers. "In the meantime, you're under arrest for impersonating federal officers and conspiracy to commit murder." What followed was not the dramatic gunfight that Eliza had been expecting, but a rather anticlimactic surrender. Faced with legitimate federal authority and overwhelming evidence of their crimes, Most of Roland's mercenaries threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. A few tried to flee and were quickly run down by Williams's cavalry troopers. Roland himself was the last to surrender, standing alone in the center of the burning camp, with his ornate pistol still in his hand. For a moment, Eliza thought he might try to shoot his way out, but even his massive ego wasn't enough to overcome simple mathematics. "This isn't over," he said as the marshal's men placed him in shackles. "I have friends in Washington, connections you can't imagine. I'll be free within a week, and when I am, and when you are, you'll be facing federal charges for treason." Williams interrupted. "The silver mining scheme you've been running, it's been selling strategic materials to foreign interests, including Mexican revolutionaries and European arms dealers. That makes you an enemy of the United States, Mr. Matthews." Roland's face went ashen as the full scope of his predicament became clear. He had been so focused on the immediate profits of his various schemes that he had never considered where the money trail ultimately led. Now he was discovering that greed had made him a traitor to his own country. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons and the wounded tended to, Eliza found herself sitting by the stream that ran through the camp, watching the water flow clear and clean, despite all the violence that had raged around it. The sacred silver deposits that had caused so much bloodshed lay hidden beneath the earth, waiting for hands that would treat them with the respect they deserved. Chayton approached and sat beside her, his own wounds bandaged, but his spirit apparently intact. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. Eliza considered the question. She could return to Boston, reclaim her place in civilized society, and try to rebuild the life that Roland had shattered. But that life belonged to someone else, now a woman who had been defined by her suffering and limitations. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." Chayton's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "The people have already given you a name," he said. "Eliza Runningwolf, the healer who stands and fights." 6 months later, Dr. Eliza Runningwolf stood before the newly constructed medical school that bore her name, watching as her first class of students, both Native American and white, filed in for their morning lessons. The building was simple, but well-built, constructed with lumber, milled from trees that had been harvested sustainably from the mountainsides. It hadn't been easy. The territorial government had initially refused to recognize the school's credentials, and many in the white community had viewed her marriage to Chayton with suspicion and hostility. There had been fights in the territorial legislature, legal challenges to the land grants that made the school possible, and more than one attempt at sabotage by those who preferred the old ways of racial separation. But there had also been unexpected allies. Marshal Williams had become a powerful advocate for the project, using his influence in Washington to secure federal funding and accreditation. Several prominent doctors from Eastern universities had agreed to serve as visiting professors, bringing the latest medical knowledge to the frontier. And slowly, gradually, the hostility of the local communities had given way to grudging respect as they saw the practical benefits of having skilled healers available regardless of racial boundaries. The school's success was built on a simple premise that healing was a universal human need that transcended cultural differences. Students learned both Western medical techniques and traditional Native American remedies, understanding that each approach had its strengths and limitations. They studied anatomy from textbooks and learned to identify medicinal plants in the wild. They practiced surgical procedures and participated in sweat lodge ceremonies that cleansed both body and spirit. It was revolutionary work, the kind that attracted attention from medical institutions around the world. But for Eliza, the most rewarding moments came not from the accolades or recognition, but from seeing former enemies working side by side to save lives. Like young Sarah Morrison, no relation to the dead gunman who had shared her surname, a white settler's daughter who had initially refused to be treated by savage medicine, but had gradually come to appreciate the holistic approach that Native healers brought to their work. Or Thomas Running Bear's son, who had overcome his father's guilt about the betrayal to become one of the school's most promising students. The integration hadn't been without its challenges. Some of the white students struggled with the spiritual aspects of native healing practices, while some of the native students found Western medicine's reductionist approach frustrating. There were personality conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, and the occasional fight that had to be broken up by the instructors. But somehow it worked. The shared goal of healing created bonds that transcended racial and cultural differences. Students who might have viewed each other as enemies in the outside world found themselves working together to save the life of a child with pneumonia or set the broken bones of an injured minor. Nadi, now officially the school's professor of traditional healing arts, had proved to be a gifted teacher despite her lack of formal education. Her practical wisdom and deep understanding of human nature made her popular with students from both cultures. She had a gift for seeing past surface differences to the universal human experiences that connected all people. Pain is pain, she would tell her classes. Doesn't matter if it comes from a white man's bullet or a Comanche arrow. The body wants to heal, and it's our job to help it along. Chayton had taken on the role of the school's administrator, using his knowledge of both cultures to navigate the complex political landscape that surrounded their work. He had proven to be a skilled diplomat, building relationships with government officials, tribal leaders, and prominent citizens throughout the territory. But it was in the quiet moments when the students had gone home and the building was empty, except for the two of them, that Eliza felt most grateful for the path her life had taken. As she and Chayton worked together to prepare for the next day's classes, she was struck by the peaceful domesticity of it all, so different from the tension and fear that had characterized her marriage to Roland. "Any regrets?" Chayton asked one evening as they locked up the school and walked home together under a sky full of stars. Eliza considered the question seriously. Her life now was harder in many ways than it had been in Boston. She worked longer hours for less pay-faced, constant political opposition and lived in a rough frontier town that lacked many of the civilized amenities she had once taken for granted. But she was free. Free to speak her mind, free to pursue her calling as a healer, free to love and be loved, without fear of violence or retribution. She had found her true self in the most unlikely place, among people she had been taught to consider enemies. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to run." The news of Roland's fate had reached them through official channels several months after his arrest. The federal investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the territorial government and beyond. Roland himself had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, his fortune seized to compensate his victims. But perhaps more satisfying than his legal punishment was the knowledge that his grand schemes had ultimately come to nothing. The silver deposits he had tried so hard to control remained under Comanche management, extracted using traditional methods that were both more efficient and more environmentally sustainable than anything his engineers had devised. The medical school that Eliza and Chayton had built on the ruins of his ambitions had become a model for cross-cultural cooperation, attracting visitors and students from around the world. Where Roland had sought to create division and exploitation, they had built understanding and healing. As they reached their small house on the edge of town, a modest structure that was nevertheless larger and more comfortable than the teepee where Eliza had first found refuge, she reflected on how much her definition of success had changed. Once she had measured her worth by her husband's social status and her ability to meet his impossible standards. Now she measured it by the number of lives she could touch, the barriers she could break down, and the hope she could kindle in others who faced seemingly impossible circumstances. It wasn't perfect. The town of Haven, as it had come to be known, still faced serious challenges. Funding for the school was always precarious, dependent on the shifting winds of federal policy and territorial politics. There were still those who viewed the cooperation between white and native communities with suspicion and hostility. Winter was harsh in the mountains, and resources were often scarce. But it was real in a way that her previous life had never been. Every success had been earned through hard work and determination, every relationship built on mutual respect rather than fear or social obligation. When she woke up each morning, she knew that the day ahead would bring meaningful work and genuine human connection. And when she lay down each night beside the man who had shown her what love without violence looked like, she knew that she had found something worth all the struggles and sacrifices, a life that was truly her own. The story might have ended there with happiness achieved and justice served. But life, as Eliza had learned, rarely follows the neat patterns of storybooks. Even as she and Chayton built their school and their marriage, forces beyond their control were gathering that would test everything they had accomplished. The success of their experiment in cross-cultural healing had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Medical schools in the East were beginning to show interest in their methods, offering partnerships and exchanges that could bring significant resources to their work. But such attention also brought scrutiny from those who preferred the old ways of racial separation and mistrust. A new territorial governor had been appointed, a man named Morrison, whose political career had been built on promises to restore order to the frontier. His interpretation of order did not include Native Americans and whites working together as equals, and he had made it clear that he intended to bring Haven into line with more conventional arrangements. There were also practical challenges that couldn't be solved with good intentions and hard work. The school's success had attracted more students than they could properly accommodate, and the waiting list for admission grew longer each year. The medical supplies they needed were expensive and often difficult to obtain on the frontier, and several of their most promising students had been forced to drop out due to financial hardship. But perhaps the greatest challenge was the one that Eliza had not anticipated: success itself. As the school's reputation grew, so did the pressure to expand, to standardize, to become more like the conventional medical institutions of the East. There were lucrative offers to franchise their methods, to train other instructors who could establish similar schools in other territories. It was tempting to accept such offers, both for the financial security they would provide and for the opportunity to spread their methods more widely. But Eliza and Chayton both worried that expansion might mean losing the intimate personal character that made their school effective. "We're not just teaching medical techniques," Chayton argued during one of their late-night planning sessions. "We're healing the wounds between our peoples. That takes time, patience, and personal relationships that can't be mass-produced." Eliza agreed, but she also recognized the reality of their situation. "If we don't expand, we'll always be vulnerable to political pressure," she pointed out. "One change of administration, one shift in federal policy, and everything we've built could be destroyed. But if we have schools in multiple territories, multiple states, even it becomes much harder for any single political authority to shut us down." It was a dilemma with no easy answers, the kind of problem that required wisdom beyond what either of them possessed individually. In the end, they did what they had learned to do in their marriage and their work. They sought the counsel of their community. The meeting they called brought together students, faculty, tribal elders, and prominent citizens from the surrounding area. It was held in the school's main lecture hall, with people sitting on the floor when the chairs ran out, and overflow crowds gathering outside the windows to listen. Nady spoke first, her weathered hands gesturing as she outlined the spiritual dimensions of their work. "Healing isn't just about fixing what's broken," she said. "It's about restoring balance, bringing harmony where there was discord. If we lose sight of that in our eagerness to grow, we'll become just another school turning out doctors who know how to cut and stitch, but not how to truly heal." Thomas Running Bear offered a different perspective shaped by his experience of betrayal and redemption. "I've seen what happens when good people remain isolated, when they don't build alliances beyond their immediate community," he said. "Roland Matthews was able to threaten my daughter because I had no friends in the white world, no one who would stand up for her. If we want to protect what we've built, we need friends and allies everywhere." The debate continued long into the night, with passionate arguments on all sides. Some favored rapid expansion, seeing it as the best way to spread their message of healing and reconciliation. Others preferred to focus on deepening their work in the local community, believing that true change had to start small and grow organically. In the end, it was one of the students who suggested the solution that would shape their future. Sarah Morrison, the settler's daughter, who had overcome her initial prejudices to become one of their most dedicated students, stood up in the back of the room and cleared her throat nervously. "What if we don't have to choose?" she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd's murmuring. "What if we keep this school as our home base, our center, but we also send out teachers and students to establish smaller programs in other communities? Not full schools necessarily, but clinics and training programs that can plant seeds for future growth." The suggestion sparked a new round of discussion, but this time the tone was different. Instead of debating whether to expand or not, they were exploring how to expand in a way that preserved their core values while extending their influence. Over the following months, they developed what came to be known as the Haven Model, a decentralized network of healing centers that maintained connection to the original school while adapting to local conditions and needs. Each center would be staffed by graduates of the main program, supported by local volunteers, and guided by the principles of cross-cultural cooperation and holistic healing. The first satellite program was established in a mining town 2 days' ride to the south, where conflicts between white miners and Native American communities had led to frequent violence and mutual mistrust. The clinic they established there was small and modestly equipped, but it served as a neutral ground where people from both communities could come for treatment without fear of prejudice or hostility. The success of that first satellite program led to requests from other communities, and within 2 years, the Haven Network included a dozen small clinics and training programs scattered across the territory. Each was unique, reflecting the specific needs and cultures of its community, but all shared the fundamental commitment to healing that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The expansion brought new challenges, of course. Communications between the scattered centers were slow and unreliable, making coordination difficult. Some communities proved more resistant to change than others, and several programs failed despite the best efforts of their dedicated staff. The financial burden of supporting multiple operations stretched their resources thin, and there were times when it seemed the whole network might collapse under its own weight. But there were also unexpected benefits. The diversity of the network meant that innovations developed in one location could be adapted and applied elsewhere. A new technique for treating altitude sickness discovered in the mountain communities proved valuable in the desert clinics as well. Traditional remedies shared by one tribal community enhanced the healing practices available to all. More importantly, the network created a community of healers who shared more than just medical knowledge. They shared a vision of what society could become when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice. When political pressure mounted in one location, support came from others. When resources were scarce in one area, others shared what they had. For Eliza, the growth of the network represented both the fulfillment of her deepest hopes and the source of her greatest fears. On one hand, she could see the concrete results of their work communities that had been torn by racial violence, learning to live in peace. Children growing up without the prejudices that had divided their parents, healers trained in methods that honored both scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom. On the other hand, she worried that success might breed complacency, that the very achievement of their goals might cause people to forget how fragile such progress could be. History was full of examples of promising social movements that had collapsed when their founders grew old or died, leaving no sustainable institutions to carry on their work. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Chayton found her sitting by the stream where they had first talked about building the school. 5 years had passed since then, and both of them showed the effects of the hard work and constant stress that their mission had demanded. But there was a peace in both their faces that had been absent in those early desperate days. "Having doubts?" he asked, settling down beside her on the familiar rocks. "Always," Eliza replied with a rueful smile. "But different doubts than I used to have. I used to worry about whether we could succeed at all. Now I worry about whether our success will outlast us." Chayton nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather used to say that the best way to ensure the future was to teach children to ask the right questions, not just to accept the right answers. Do you think we've done that?" Eliza considered the question as she watched the water flow past their feet. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the evening shift change at the school students heading home after a long day of classes, faculty members locking up laboratories and classrooms, the quiet bustle of a community going about its daily business. "I think," she said finally, "that we've at least started. Whether it continues will depend on choices that haven't been made yet by people who haven't been born yet. All we can do is give them the best foundation we can and trust them to build on it." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah Morrison appeared on the path leading down to the stream. She was no longer the frightened, prejudiced girl who had first come to the school, but a confident young woman who had recently been accepted for advanced training at a medical college in Boston. Her presence represented both the school's success and one of its ongoing challenges: how to keep their best students from being drawn away by opportunities in the East. "Dr. Running Wolf, Mr. Chayton," she called out as she approached. "I wanted to talk to you before I left for Boston tomorrow." They had known this conversation was coming. Sarah's acceptance to the prestigious medical program represented an enormous opportunity, but it also meant losing one of their most promising students to the very establishment they had worked so hard to change. "You don't have to explain," Eliza said gently. "We understand the choice you're facing." "No, I don't think you do," Sarah replied, surprising them both. "I'm not going to Boston to leave all this behind. I'm going to learn everything I can about the latest medical techniques, the newest equipment, the most advanced treatments available. And then I'm coming back to teach them here." She sat down on the rocks beside them, her enthusiasm evident in every word. "Don't you see, we've proven that cross-cultural healing works, that people can overcome their prejudices when they have a shared goal. But we're still limited by the resources available on the frontier. If I can bring back the best of what the Eastern schools have to offer, we can give our students advantages that no one else has." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, covering not just Sarah's specific plans, but the broader question of how the Haven Network could continue to evolve and adapt. Other students had received similar offers, and the question of whether to encourage or discourage such opportunities had been a source of ongoing debate among the faculty. By the time they parted ways, they had developed the framework for what would become known as the Bridge Program, a systematic effort to send their best students to leading institutions around the world with the understanding that they would return to share their knowledge and help train the next generation of cross-cultural healers. It was a bold vision, one that required significant financial investment and posed considerable risks. Some students might indeed be seduced by the opportunities available elsewhere and never return. Others might come back changed by their experiences, no longer committed to the collaborative approach that had made Haven unique. But it was also the logical next step in their evolution. If they truly believed that their methods were superior to traditional approaches, then they had an obligation to engage with the broader medical community, rather than remaining isolated on the frontier. The years that followed proved both the wisdom and the difficulty of this approach. Sarah Morrison did indeed return from Boston, bringing with her new surgical techniques and a network of Eastern contacts, who began to take serious interest in the Haven model. But she also brought challenges, as her advanced training sometimes clashed with the more intuitive methods favored by traditional healers. Other students who participated in the Bridge program had mixed results. Some became powerful advocates for cross-cultural healing in their adopted institutions, gradually changing attitudes and practices from within. Others found themselves caught between two worlds, unable to fully embrace either the cutting-edge science of the East or the holistic wisdom of the frontier. Through it all, Eliza and Chayton found themselves constantly adapting, learning, and growing. The school that had started as a simple dream of bringing people together had evolved into something far more complex and ambitious, a living laboratory for social change that attracted attention from around the world. Delegations of visitors became a regular feature of life in Haven, as educators, politicians, and social reformers came to see for themselves how the seemingly impossible task of racial reconciliation was being accomplished. Some came as admirers, eager to replicate the model in their own communities. Others came as skeptics, looking for flaws and contradictions that would validate their belief that such cooperation was impossible. Both types of visitors served useful purposes. The admirers provided moral support and sometimes valuable resources, while the skeptics forced the community to constantly examine and improve their methods. The need to articulate and defend their approach helped crystallize the principles that guided their work. Perhaps the most important of these principles was what Nady called the healing circle. The idea that true healing required the participation of the entire community, not just the healer and the patient. This meant that medical treatment was always embedded in a larger context of social relationships, cultural understanding, and spiritual practice. It was a radical departure from the individualistic approach favored by most Western medicine, and it sometimes clashed with the expectations of patients who wanted quick fixes for complex problems. But it also produced results that amazed even the most experienced physicians among their visitors. Chronic conditions that had resisted treatment elsewhere often improved dramatically when patients became part of the Haven community. Depression lifted when isolated individuals found meaningful roles in the healing process. Addiction problems that had seemed hopeless yielded to treatment approaches that addressed not just the chemical dependency, but the social and spiritual emptiness that had given rise to it. The success of these methods gradually attracted the attention of medical researchers who were beginning to question the strictly scientific approach that had dominated their field for generations. They came to Haven not just to observe, but to collaborate, conducting studies that documented the effectiveness of cross-cultural healing practices. Their work provided the scientific validation that helped legitimize the Haven model in the eyes of the broader medical establishment. But it also created new tensions, as the act of studying and documenting traditional practices sometimes seemed to diminish their spiritual power and cultural authenticity. Navigating these tensions required a delicate balance that tested all of Eliza's diplomatic skills. She had to satisfy the researchers' need for rigorous data while protecting the traditional healers' concerns about cultural appropriation. She had to maintain academic credibility while preserving the intuitive, holistic approach that made their methods effective. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the constant pressure to expand and evolve. Every success brought new opportunities and new responsibilities, until it sometimes seemed that the simple dream of healing had been overwhelmed by the complexity of institutional management. During these moments of doubt and fatigue, Eliza often returned to the stream where she and Chayton had first talked about their hopes for the future. The water continued to flow, as it always had, clear and clean, despite all the changes that had transformed the valley around it. In its constancy, she found a reminder of what truly mattered. The measures of success that seemed so important to their visitors, the number of students trained, the recognition received from prestigious institutions, the political influence achieved, were less significant than the fundamental transformation that had occurred in the relationships between peoples who had once viewed each other as enemies. Children who had grown up in Haven took for granted the idea that healing was a shared responsibility that different cultural approaches could complement rather than compete with each other, that cooperation was both possible and beneficial. For them, the racial prejudices that had divided earlier generations seemed as ancient and irrelevant as the feuds between long-dead European monarchs. It was in watching these children that Eliza found her greatest source of hope for the future. They were living proof that the cycles of mistrust and violence that had characterized frontier life were not inevitable, that different choices could lead to different outcomes. Some of these children would undoubtedly leave Haven for opportunities elsewhere, just as Sarah Morrison had done. But they would carry with them the lessons they had learned about cooperation and healing, spreading those lessons to new communities and new generations. Others would stay building on the foundation that their parents and teachers had established. They would face new challenges that their elders could not anticipate, but they would face them with tools and perspectives that had been forged in the crucible of cross-cultural cooperation. As Eliza reflected on all that had been accomplished and all that remained to be done, she realized that her own journey from victim to healer was just one small part of a much larger transformation. The woman who had fled Boston in terror, clutching 50 cents and a bag full of evidence, had become Dr. Eliza Runningwolf, a recognized leader in the movement for social healing. But more important than any title or recognition was the knowledge that she had found her true calling, her authentic self, in the most unlikely of circumstances. The pain and fear that had driven her to flee had ultimately led her to a life richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined in her days as Roland's wife. The scars of her past would always be with her, just as the scars of historical injustice would always mark the relationships between Native and white communities. But scars were also signs of healing evidence that wounds could close and strength could return. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson that Haven had to offer, that healing was always possible, no matter how deep the wounds or how long they had festered. It required courage, patience, and the willingness to see beyond the surface differences that seemed to divide people, but it was possible, and it was worth the effort. As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded their valley, casting long shadows across the buildings and paths, where so much learning and healing had taken place, Eliza felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The road had been hard marked by violence and loss and struggle, but it had led to something beautiful and lasting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to heal and be healed. But tonight, it was enough to sit by the stream, with the man she loved, listening to the water flow, and feeling the peace that came from knowing she had found her place in the world. The story of Eliza Runningwolf was far from over. In the years to come, she would face new trials and achieve new triumphs, would see the Haven model spread to dozens of communities across the continent, would train hundreds of healers who would carry on her work long after she was gone. But the essential transformation had already occurred. The frightened, broken woman who had hidden behind a water trough in the rain had become someone who stood and fought, who healed and was healed, who chose love over fear and cooperation over conflict. In the end, that transformation was the real measure of success, not the institutions built or the recognition achieved, but the human heart made whole, again ready to help others on their own journeys toward healing. And in a world that often seemed determined to tear itself apart with hatred and violence, that was perhaps the most revolutionary act of all the simple, radical choice to heal, instead of harm to build bridges, instead of walls, to see the humanity in those who had been labeled as enemies. It was a choice that Eliza Runningwolf made every day, in every interaction with every patient who came seeking help. And it was a choice that would outlive her, carried forward by all those whose lives she had touched, and who would in turn touch the lives of others. The stream would continue to flow, carrying its clear waters toward distant valleys, where new communities would grow and new possibilities would take root. And somewhere in that flow, the spirit of healing that had been kindled in one small corner of the frontier would continue its endless journey, bringing hope and wholeness to a world that needed both more than it knew.